What if some of the most cherished stories, the ones we've known for centuries, weren't exactly historical accounts? What if they were powerful narratives crafted much, much later? And what happens when cold, hard archaeological evidence, stuff dug from the ground, clashes head-on with these deeply held traditions?
Oh, it's definitely more than just a clash, isn't it? It's a profound intellectual challenge. It forces us, really, to reevaluate how we understand history, identity, even the nature of storytelling itself. How do we square these different ways of knowing?
Exactly. And today we're diving into a book that doesn't just ask these questions, but offers, well, a pretty radical reinterpretation based on decades of actual scientific inquiry. It's the Bible Unearthed, Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel and the Origin of its Sacred Texts. A truly groundbreaking work. This is a deep dive you won't want to miss.
It really is a landmark publication, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And the authors, Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, they're uniquely positioned for this. Finkelstein, he's a professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University. His name is, well, it's basically synonymous with major excavations at key biblical sites. Think Shiloh, Megiddo, places that have really reshaped
Yeah.
how we see Iron Age Israel.
Right. And Silberman, he's the director of historical interpretation for the INAIM Center in Belgium and also a contributing editor to Archaeology magazine. He brings this amazing ability to synthesize really complex archaeological stuff into narratives people can actually follow. Their combined expertise, fieldwork, biblical studies, history, it gives them real authority here.
Absolutely. You see, when it was published back in 2001, the Bible Unearthed wasn't just another ancient history book. No, it was a direct, almost urgent response to this growing pile of archaeological evidence that, frankly, just didn't fit the traditional literal readings of many Bible stories. The ground itself was telling a different story.
And their mission, the way they put it, was pretty profound. They aim to offer a new archaeological vision of ancient Israel, in which the Bible is one of the most important artifacts and cultural achievements, not the unquestioned narrative framework into which every archaeological find must be fit. So it wasn't about tossing the Bible out, but kind of recontextualizing it based on the physical evidence.
Precisely. They were explicitly aiming to challenge fundamentalist interpretations of Scripture. That was a key goal. They wanted to present a dramatically revised portrait of ancient Israel, one that's firmly rooted in the material record, the actual stuff found in the earth. And their audience was broad. Scholars, sure, but also general readers, and maybe most importantly, people wrestling with how to reconcile this science with their faith.
So today, we'll unpack how this book systematically takes apart some traditional views, look at the impressive evidence they bring to the table, the controversies, there were controversies, and why these arguments are still so intellectually demanding, still debated today. And just so you know, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's NotebookLM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Right. So where to start? The genesis of the book, really. It stems from this critical problem.
Yeah.
For decades, finds in the Near East just kept contradicting the traditional Bible timelines.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a small issue. It created a real intellectual need, a sort of pressure for a new framework that could make sense of this widening gap.
Yeah, it wasn't just like one or two odd finds. It was the cumulative weight of evidence, wasn't it? The stuff from the ground just wasn't matching the stories people had taken as literal history for ages. And like you said, they weren't just writing for academics. They aimed straight at those deeply ingrained fundamentalist views.
Indeed. And to do this, Finkelstein and Silberman used a very systematic methodology. It wasn't just about digging. They combined rigorous historical criticism, analyzing the texts themselves, context, literary development, with a really strong emphasis on the archaeology, letting the soil speak first, so to speak.
And they structure their argument very deliberately. They conduct what they call an archaeological analysis of the patriarchal, conquest, judges, and united monarchy narratives.
Yeah.
They don't just pick and choose. They work through these core biblical periods methodically.
Exactly. They peel back the layers chronologically, period by period. But crucially, at the same time, they're reconstructing the separate histories of Israel and Judah based directly on the archaeological finds. This method really lets them highlight where the material evidence diverges sharply from the biblical story, or where the story seems to reflect a much later time period altogether.
And when we talk about evidence, it's not just a few bits of pottery, is it? They marshal a really impressive amount of empirical data.
Oh, far from it. It's genuinely impressive empirical evidence, gathered from digs not just in Israel, but across Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, too. It's a wide-ranging synthesis. And the types of evidence, yes, artifacts like pottery and tools, monumental building, sure. but also subtle things like shifts in settlement patterns over time, and they go deeper still.
Deeper how? What kind of granular data are we talking about? It sounds like they really dug into the details, pardon the
So,
pun.
well, yeah. Beyond structures, they looked at things like animal bones, tells you about diet, economy, seeds where people growing, even chemical analysis of soil samples, which can point to old industries or how land was used. Plus, they bring in long-term anthropological models comparing ancient Israel to other cultures to understand social development. It's a really rigorous, multi-layered approach.
Okay, let's get into the core argument, because this is where things get really fascinating and, well, challenging for a lot of people. They use this dual approach, right? Something about absence of evidence and positive evidence.
Yes, exactly. They start by pointing out that for many famous biblical stories, when you look at the traditional dates, there's a striking absence of compelling archaeological evidence. Think about the Exodus, a huge migration, supposedly. You'd expect some archaeological trace, wouldn't you? Campsites, pottery, burials along the route in Sinai. They argue, for the traditional time frame, that evidence just isn't there.
So it's not just that they haven't found the smoking gun artifact, it's the lack of any expected footprint that becomes part of the argument itself.
Right.
Interesting. But they don't just stop at what's missing, right? What's the positive evidence side?
That's the other crucial pillar. They don't just say it didn't happen then. They also present clear archaeological evidence that places the stories themselves in a late 7th century BCE context. And BCE, of course, means before the Common Era, same as BC. They're basically suggesting these foundational stories were written down, or at least compiled in the form we know them, centuries after the events they claim to describe.
Wow, that's a massive shift in timing. So their logic is kind of deductive. If the archaeology consistently contradicts the traditional dates and scale, then those traditional interpretations need rethinking. And the texts themselves likely come from much later. What are some of the most startling claims that come out of this?
Well, what's really striking and, provocative is their assertion that many of the most famous stories in the Bible, the wanderings of the patriarchs, the Exodus from Egypt, Joshua's conquest of Canaan, and David and Solomon's vast empire reflect the world of the later authors rather than actual historical facts. So archaeologically, the patriarchs look more like Iron Age figures. The Exodus lacks support. Joshua's supposed widespread destruction of cities doesn't match the burn layers, or lack thereof, at those sites.
So they're not saying the stories are meaningless, but that their historical setting, their composition, belongs much later, serving the political and religious needs of people living in a totally different time. That is a huge reevaluation. Now, when you make claims that big, that iconoclastic, as they put it, building credibility ethos is absolutely vital. Beyond their CVs, how do they build that trust?
They do it through, I think, remarkable transparency about their methods. That's just good scholarship. They openly admit, look, our approach and conclusions are not particularly new. They point out similar findings have been accepted by the majority of biblical scholars and archaeologists for years. That honesty actually strengthens their position. They aren't claiming to be lone geniuses. They're synthesizing and communicating a challenging but established scholarly direction.
It's like they're saying, look, we didn't invent this, but we're putting it all together clearly for a wider audience. And they're also quite deft with sort of subtle emotional appeals, aren't they? Using words like iconoclastic, provocative, groundbreaking definitely primes the reader.
It does build anticipation, yes. But crucially, they also conclude by acknowledging the Bible's great spiritual and emotional power. That's really important. It shows respect for what the text means to people personally, even while they're challenging its historical accuracy on many points. It allows for critical thinking without just dismissing the text's significance. They separate historical claims from spiritual or cultural value.
You know, this kind of deep dive, exploring challenging ideas and encouraging rational thought, is exactly what we aim for on Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel. If this discussion resonates with you, you'll find more explorations there, inspiring reflection and deeper engagement with complex topics. Check it out. Now back to Finkelstein and Silberman. How did they manage to make such complex stuff accessible?
Well, their rhetorical skill extends to their language, too. They use precise academic terms when needed: stratigraphy, epigraphy, Iron Age 2, Iron Age 2, things like that. But they always balance it. They provide clear explanations, translating these complex archaeological concepts for a general reader without ever sounding condescending. It's a fine line, and they walk it well.
That's quite an achievement, bridging that gap between deep scholarship and a popular audience, especially when challenging core beliefs. And their structural approach helps too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. What's really effective is how they strategically juxtapose things. They constantly contrast the power and poetry of biblical saga, the amazing stories we know, with the more down-to-earth events and processes of ancient Near Eastern history that archaeology reveals. This technique lets them acknowledge the Bible's literary power, its cultural weight, while clearly distinguishing that from literal historical accuracy. That distinction is fundamental to their whole argument.
Okay, so given how provocative and well-argued the book is, it makes sense it stirred up a lot of debate. A bestseller, yes, but it definitely faced criticism, right?
Oh, absolutely. A firestorm, you might say, in academic and religious circles.
Yeah.
The main criticism, even from scholars who accepted some of the archaeological data, often centered on what critics called overreach in interpretive claims.
Overreach. What does that mean in practical terms? Can you give an example?
Sure. Michael D. Coogan, a very respected biblical scholar, is often quoted on this. He argued the authors sometimes move from the hypothetical to the improbable to the absurd. He specifically highlighted that Finkelstein's revised lower chronology, which is pretty central to their dating arguments, is not accepted by the majority of archaeologists and biblical scholars.
Yeah.
So the issue isn't always the raw data, the pottery, the layers. It's the interpretation placed upon that data, especially when linking it directly to the biblical text or redating major periods. That's where the friction really lies.
Right. So the archaeological evidence itself might be solid, groundbreaking even, but some peers felt they pushed the interpretations too far. Moving from what the dirt can tell us to maybe speculating a bit too much about exactly when and why specific biblical texts were written, drawing too neat a line between finds and narrative composition.
Exactly. Critics argue their interpretive reach sometimes exceeds their archaeological grasp. For instance, attributing the authorship of major narratives to very specific political agendas in the 7th century Judean kingdom. Some scholars would say, well, that's plausible, maybe even likely, but can the archaeology prove it definitively? That step from evidence to motive to specific compositional context is where the debate gets really intense and, honestly, continues today.
So wrapping this up, what's the lasting impact of the Bible Unearthed? It clearly succeeded in its main goal, providing a powerful archaeological lens on biblical history. It forced a huge conversation, both scholarly and public, that's still going. It challenged traditional assumptions, absolutely, but managed to do so while maintaining respect for the Bible's cultural and spiritual importance.
It undeniably reframed the whole relationship between archaeology and biblical studies for a generation. But it is important for you, the listener, to remember. While the book's core idea that archaeology often contradicts literal readings of the Bible is pretty mainstream in scholarship now, many of its specific conclusions, especially around Finkelstein's lower chronology, are still actively debated. It's not a settled issue. It's an ongoing, fascinating, scholarly conversation.
And for those of you who really appreciate these deep dives into complex topics, encouraging rational thought, do consider exploring Mindful Moments and our other podcasts. We tackle more compelling books and big ideas like this one.
This book really did leave a mark, though.
Mm-hmm.
It pushed boundaries, forced confrontation with evidence, made us all think harder about how we construct the past from different kinds of sources.
So, the final thought to leave you with, what does it mean for our understanding of identity, of faith, of history itself, when the very foundations we thought were solid rock are reshaped by the archaeologist's spade and careful analysis? To dig deeper into this really thought-provoking book, click the link on screen for our in-depth book summary. Please subscribe to our channel, share this deep dive with others who wrestle with these big questions, consider buying the book via the link, and always, always remember to think rationally.